Good afternoon. Welcome to the Korea Society. I am Steve Noerper, the Senior Director for Policy here at the Korea Society. I begin my ninth year next week, so I guess I'm getting older. And I also teach up at Columbia, and I'm a fellow at the Weatherhead East Asia Institute. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Sumi Terry, and I'll get to a proper introduction in a minute, but she's up from CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, to join us today. Before we begin, we'd like to take a moment of silence, one in observance of those who perished in the terrible fire in Korea today, and in remembrance of them and in sympathy to the families and those affected in Korea. And also on the passing of Dr. David Kim, who was a humanitarian located out of Eugene, Oregon with Holt International. He passed away this week and was one of the individuals who helped establish the adoption network and brought Korean war orphans in the 1950s to the United States and saved many lives and built real and lasting Korea-U.S. friendship. So we could just take a moment of observance. Thank you for that. And welcome to our spring season, winter, spring, properly. And we're very happy to have you here. And we have about 60 plus people in-house today. We'd also like to acknowledge those who are live streaming and to especially thank those who have come from New York University's Center for Global Affairs, as well as those streaming from Columbia University, SIPA. It is a pleasure to welcome Sue to the stage. She has been a long and strong supporter of the Korea Society. She has been prolific in her career, having spent 8 years with the Central Intelligence Agency, having worked on the National Security Council under President George W. Bush, having served as a National Intelligence Fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations, having worked out of Columbia's Weatherhead East Asian Institute, and having taught at Columbia, and having served most recently as Bauer Group Asia's managing director. She has moved to Washington to help increase the bandwidth in Washington, D.C. at the Center for Strategic and International Studies on Korea. And many of you in the audience know that our good friend Victor Cha is hopefully moving on to be the next United States ambassador to Korea. And so Sue will be building that program even further. And we're just delighted to have her here. She's also a close personal friend, and she and I share a connection from Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, where she attended. And she also attended NYU prior to that. So those of you from NYU, you have a good alumni here in the audience. We thought we would talk today in the spirit of forecasting here in January about the events on the peninsula. Certainly there is a lot that gives us pause. There is a great deal that we need to consider going forward. And clearly last year, with the large number of missile tests and nuclear tests, we are at a point where there's tremendous concern about next steps on North Korea and the state of North Korea's missile and nuclear development. There is also, as we have seen, the Olympics just around the corner, and we here at the Korea Society have been celebrating those with numerous programs. We invite you back as well for the opening ceremonies, which we'll do here the morning of the 9th of February. But the Olympics, in this case, has been greatly politicized in several different ways, and we will get to that in a moment. But clearly the idea of the inter-Korean dialogue that has been spurred forward in anticipation of the Olympics, the participation of North Korea there, some questions we may get to about Prime Minister Abe's visit to the Olympics and the issue of the comfort women or sex slaves, and other aspects of this being the first of the Northeast Asia Games, meaning Pyeongchang 2018, Tokyo 2020, and Beijing 2022. So to help us decipher where we are sitting here at the end of January 2018, and also to look ahead to the year and what happens after the Olympics, is Dr. Sue Terry. So Sue, thank you, and look forward to having a nice conversation.
Thank you.
We are at what many of us consider a very tense time and a critical juncture. What is your general read on where we sit relative to those missile tests and relative to the September nuclear test?
So I welcome this slight thaw between inter-Korea relations that we're going through right now with North Korea's decision to send a delegation of athletes and cheerleaders and whatnot. Huge, actually, it's a pretty big delegation that's going to the Olympics. But I do think we have to be very clear-eyed about this, and I do think we should temper our expectation that this is somehow going to drastically improve the nuclear and missile crisis. From the North Korean perspective, this makes complete sense. They're sending 22 athletes, but 230 cheerleaders, the taekwondo demonstrators, the orchestra, I mean, the whole shebang. Why does it make sense for Kim Jong-un? I mean, what is there to lose? There's absolutely no financial or political cost of doing this. They get to have a complete image makeover on a world stage. That 230 cheerleaders are the most vetted. Believe me, they are going to be the most beautiful North Korean women who are going to go there to be part of as the cheerleader delegation. So they get to have an image makeover. They get to maybe try to create a fissure between Seoul and Washington going forward. This is sort of an insurance policy also if there's going to be provocation later down the road. Point is, there's nothing to lose from North Korean perspective. The concern I have is once the Olympics and Paralympics is over, and right now there's a postponement of U.S.-South Korea joint military exercises until the Paralympics is over, which will take us until March 18th. We know that the Kim family regime is not used to giving things away for nothing. They always demand things. So my concern is what will they demand for inter-Korea dialogue and engagement and for that all of that to continue. The Moon administration is rightfully very, right now their priority is to have a successful Olympics. And they do want to make sure that this inter-Korea thaw and engagement goes beyond just inter-Korea to make progress on the nuclear missile program, to make progress in terms of U.S.-North Korea relations. But North Korea will demand, and I think will make the Moon government, put Moon government in a very difficult situation. You've heard North Korea already said, joint exercise should be forever postponed or scrapped. So I do think at minimum, beyond North Korea looking for sanctions relief, they are going to demand there's going to be postponement, indefinite postponement of joint military exercises. And the Moon government might ask Washington for that. But if you heard Secretary Mattis, and he said, absolutely not. We are going to continue with joint military exercises because from Washington's perspective, it's readiness issue. And why would we suspend it without North Korea giving something in return? So my concern is once Paralympics is over, late March, early April, and if there is sort of a falling apart between sort of North and South conversation, we might be back to where we were last year in this kind of back to crisis mode. Now, from the Moon government's perspective, despite some concern that they might make unilateral concessions to North, I think they've been taking pretty centrist position. Like, President Moon, at least when he was campaigning, on the question of that, even talking about Kaesong Industrial Complex, possibly reopening it, he didn't do any of that. And I think the Moon government understands that Washington is not going to go for that. The Trump administration is not going to go for making any kind of concessions to North Korea right now. So again, but if South Korea does not give anything back to the North Koreans, that's going to get us back to the crisis mode. Now, what are the options from the U.S. policy perspective? That really depends on North Korea's provocations. I don't think President Trump himself has decided on the path forward. But when we keep hearing about this bloody nose or limited military strike, they're not kidding about this. This is a policy option that is being considered. And if North Korea's provocation is just beyond even just a short-range, medium-range missile, but let's say at the other end of the escalation, provocations is potential atmospheric nuclear tests, I think that's going to be a serious problem for Washington. Now, the policy options that are being debated, heatedly debated among the Korea watchers, scholars, and policymakers are, at the end of the day, beyond sanctions. We're going to continue with sanctions and pressure. But at the end of the day, can we live with nuclear North Korea? That's the key question. And there are some folks who think we seriously cannot. That somehow North Korea is different. then China, then Russia, the argument goes. That in some sense, because North Korea is not a status quo power, I'm just laying out this argument, why argument is being made that perhaps we cannot live with nuclear North Korea. Because it's not a status quo power, that somehow Kim Jong-un is different, that his intention of trying to complete the nuclear program, perfect the nuclear arsenal, it goes beyond the regime survival. Everybody knows regime survival is the most important priority for the regime. But somehow it goes beyond that there is some sort of offensive component to Kim Jong-un's intention or motivation. So you keep hearing about this, that Kim Jong-un's motive could be decoupling U.S.-South Korea alliance over the long term, kicking the U.S. forces off the Korean Peninsula, and over the long term, try to achieve unification on its own terms. You keep hearing this argument. And then there's another argument that's being made why we cannot live with nuclear North Korea, is that of potential nuclear proliferation angle. We do know that North Korea is a serial proliferator. They have proliferated everything under the sun. So if they are mass producing, it is a serious concern that we have to consider. Like, well, how are we going to deal with potential proliferation? On the other hand, there are many Korea Watcher scholars and experts who do argue that we have to live with it, because military strike or preventive military action, kinetic action, it will have unthinkable consequences, right? We forget nuclear weapons. North Korea, by the way, is already a nuclear power with maybe up to 20 to 60 nuclear warheads. Japan and South Korea are under nuclear threat already. But forget nuclear weapons, just conventional artillery alone. If there's a conflict, even with a limited strike, will Kim Jong-un not retaliate? He could retaliate. And there's 14,000 conventional artillery pieces within 60 seconds of Seoul. There's 20 million people living in Seoul. 200 American expats living there. 28,500 American soldiers. So this argument is going back and forth. But what my point is, all options are truly on the table right now. I'm just trying to sort of lay out for you some of the thinking behind what options we're going to potentially use. But so it really does depend on what that provocation is going to be. But either way, Stephen, I think 2018 is going to be a critical year, because if some resolution will come about, either we decide to sort of live with it. So if North Korea goes further, and let's say they have one more technical hurdle to really cross before they could become a nuclear power. That means having a nuclear-tipped intercontinental ballistic missile that could hit United States, which is showing successful reentry capability. So if they decide to pursue that, at some point, if they do test that, and we do decide there's no response beyond sanctions, that is a response. That is a resolution of some kind. That means we have decided to live with nuclear North Korea through the policy of sanctions, pressure, containment, deterrence, and whatnot, but we are living with it. Or we'll have some sort of kinetic response because we decided that we cannot live with it.
Okay. So a few different things. First, back towards some of your earlier comments. Moon Jae-in administration has to strike a balance on the Olympics.
Yes.
I might suggest this is not a naive administration in the sense that Moon Jae-in has lived through, supported, watched very clearly the sunshine policies under Kim Dae-jung and under Roh Moo-hyun, for whom he served as chief of staff. So he will get back to an inter-Korean process, but one that has since then seen 10 years of conservative administration. Some would suggest he knows the limitations and that perhaps outside Western U.S. analysts aren't affording the Seoul administration enough space to manage this process. How do you manage this process given what you've described as a North Korean propaganda effort and the spirit of the Olympic Games, as IOC President Thomas Bach has said, bringing nations together, right? And is there an opportunity here to lessen the level of tensions? And is that sustainable, aside from this thing you've mentioned about the push for ceasing exercises? Is there a potential for laying a foundation for some sort of dialogue process?
So that really depends where Kim Jong-un is at. On one hand, when you look at the New Year's address, or even after the third intercontinental ballistic missile test, North Korea came out with a statement that we're now done with the nuclear program. Although they did say they're going to mass produce, but they said we've completed it. So if North Korea can hold off from further testing. I think if they continue to test, we're just not going to get to the stage we are talking about. But there is a small window of opportunity right now because, again, because there is a suspension of joint military exercises, they will at least take us to the end of March time period. Now, the Moon administration wants to go beyond that. But as I told you, North Korea will absolutely demand suspension of joint military exercises. So perhaps Washington can get back with reduced military exercises, maybe not send some strategic assets. There's some way we can sort of maybe perhaps work it where we're not having a full joint exercises, but some compromise. But I'm not sure if the Trump administration
Part of the
is there
spirit
yet.
of my question is, we're assuming, and you've said, and many of our colleagues say, how Kim Jong-un goes will dictate the process.
Yeah.
Is there a different way of approaching it, which is how Moon Jae-in goes will determine this process? Is there an inherent opportunity in a Seoul-managed process, and is the United States allowing the room for that process to take place?
Yes. Well, in one sense, we are allowing at least a suspension of exercises. But again, the problem is the Moon administration is, as you said, is very clear-eyed about this. And they are not going to be able to do sanctions relief that North Korea might demand. They're not going to be able to open the Kaesong Industrial Complex, which the North Korea might might ask for because that's against UN sanctions. And as you said, the Moon administration knows that that's a non-starter for Washington. But they will have to give something to North Korea. And what would that be? And the only thing I can possibly think of is in the joint military exercises realm. Some give has to be there, and North Korea has to suspend from further testing for any kind of dialogue to take place. But Stephen, let's be really realistic here. Even if dialogue does take place, from there to a successful negotiation,
Right.
That's a huge road. I mean, we've been negotiating with North Korea also for many years. This started under the Clinton administration, okay? That's 2-term Clinton, 2-term Bush, 2-term Obama, and here we are. So to think that somehow that even if we can get to some sort of some dialogue for next few months beyond March 18th, I'm not, I don't think it's credible to really think that we can have a successful negotiation that will take care of the nuclear program this year.
Okay. Let's cut it a different angle. You mentioned the wedge tactics in terms of dividing the United States and South Korea. And the preponderance of the writings and analysis is focused on that as an objective of the North Koreans. But looking at South Korean society, there seems to be a very effective wedge tactic in further dividing the left and the right in South Korea. There is a very strong internal debate. And as a very senior Korean business person said to me yesterday, he was surprised to see the poll numbers drop for Moon Jae-in in recent days, as opposed to go up.
Yeah.
His expectation would have been the part of inter-Korean reconciliation would have bolstered those poll numbers. What do you make of the internal domestic aspect?
So that was really interesting. I think that shows you that also that it's going to be another challenge for the Moon administration just to make any kind of unilateral concessions to North Korea and just trying to move forward. Because the backlash came from South Korea domestically over this Olympic issue, not only from the conservatives, but backlash came from the younger generation, from Moon's core supporters, because they're talking about the fairness issue. Pyeongchang Olympics is now being hijacked by Pyongyang. Fairness issue with the hockey team, the female hockey team, that makes sense. These Koreans work very hard. Why should North Koreans just come in and not only do an image makeover, but then be able to participate like this? And so it makes sense. So it really shows you division in South Korean society, not only between the left and right, but I mean, as I said, the backlash came from the younger generation. And this is just yet another factor that the Moon administration has to consider in terms of how far he can go with just trying to just push for engagement with North Korea. I do think the Moon administration has learned a lot from the Sunshine Policy years, where during the Sunshine Policy years, South Korea did give $8 billion to North Korea, ended up giving about $8 billion, but it didn't really change North Korea in any kind of substantive way. But I do think it's another challenge that the Moon administration has to sort of factor in.
Interesting. One of the thoughts is that a lot of this to and fro over the two Koreas getting to the games and this debate about Pyeongchang versus Pyongyang and the criticism now coming from the right in South Korea about the nature of the games and the warning not to be manipulated. By the time we get to February 9th and the opening ceremonies, an argument made by Victor Cha and others is it becomes about the games, right? It will be about the success of Pyeongchang. It will be about the Herculean efforts of the Pyeongchang Organizing Committee. And it will be about South Korea as host and hub. And it will be about the excellence, the endurance, and the stories of those heroic athletes who participate in the game. So I've wondered in recent days if some of this smoke too will pass and that it really will be the Pyeongchang Games and that there will be a sideline narrative of what is happening with North Korea. But in terms of the external perspective, that may decrease and it may be a different story. So I'm wondering what you think the takeaway from Pyeongchang Olympics will be. You and I were just talking a little bit about the 1988 Seoul Games, and you and I will be participating in something in mid-February on democracy. But what do you think the legacy of Pyeongchang might be, could be, or maybe should be?
I'm pretty sure that Pyeongchang Olympics will be successful, as you talk about. And all of this, over the hockey team and everything else may go away, and people feel united and have a pretty good feeling about how the Olympics went. And that's not my concern. I think that's totally fine. They're going to have good Olympics. But when we're talking about nuclear missile crisis, I'm trying to still temper people's expectation that you can have successful Olympics and you will still come to the point when it's all over and done. Beautiful Olympics, beautiful Paralympics. South Koreans are great at throwing these kind of events. I'm sure it'll be great. And people feel really good about the whole thing. It's just that at the end, when it comes to end of Paralympics, end of March, early April, and we decide, the Trump administration says we have to go through with joint exercises, and that start, what will North Korea do? Will they sit and watch, or will they go back to testing? And if they do, this is what I'm saying, we're now back to that crisis mode. So I just want us to not necessarily link those two and say Olympics is somehow going to lead to progress on the nuclear missile front.
Yeah, no, and I agree with you. And I've said on Bloomberg and elsewhere that what we need to be thinking of now is what we get into by way of April to June and what could be a very hot late spring and early summer. Let's umbrella out a bit and take a look at some of the regional dynamic. So Prime Minister Abe has decided to come to the Games. There's a little debate about that. Clearly the linkage to the comfort women sex slave issue is one that he says he'll bring up with Moon Jae-in, although that seems to be an odd arena in which to bring up a historic memory issue that has been so impacting Korea-Japan relations. On the other side, we have China, which has played a very rough game with South Korea economically over THAAD deployment, very serious impact to South Korea's economy in terms of tourism, trade, and in the lead up to the Olympics, where they were hoping that there would be significant Chinese visitors as well as investment around the Games. Where do you see China's relations going with South Korea? Where do you see Japan's relations going? How does that juxtaposition with sanctions issues and what seems to be a step up in Chinese compliance for the most part, although these reports of violations of sanctions as well?
I think the Moon administration's decision to not renegotiate the Comfort Women agreement was, from their perspective, again, a sort of a centrist, a realistic approach. He could have not done that, but it is part of consideration for the Olympics, consideration for trying to improve its relationship with Japan, even though Japan doesn't like that because because South Korea still demanded a sincere apology from Japan. And Prime Minister Abe was initially not going to go to the Olympics. I think the U.S. pressured Japan a little bit on this. Because obviously from U.S.'s perspective, we want Japan and Korea to move beyond this issue. There's so much to worry about, particularly with North Korea, that we want them to move beyond this issue. So I do think it's good that Prime Minister Abe is going to go to Korea. I hope that given the sensitivities, historical sensitivities, and given just sensitivities around the Comfort Women issue, that he doesn't push the issue too far. But I do think Korea, between Japan and China and everything, I think the Moon administration is trying to balance everything. There's a little bit of hoopla over the three no's. What did South Korea and China agree to exactly to make sure that China lift those sanctions that were in place over that, and a little bit of dispute about exactly what occurred when President Moon went to China. But I think from South Korean perspective, the Moon administration is just trying to balance these regional relationships, and I think hopefully this year we'll move forward. In terms of North Korea and dealing with North Korea, China has been doing more. Surprisingly, from even Korea watchers like myself, who's been very cynical in terms of China's role on how much China is going to implement sanctions. But China has been doing more. I think that has to do with the Trump administration really pressing China. But I think China thinking that there's certain unpredictability coming out of Washington, not quite sure where the Trump administration is going to take, where he's going to go in terms of next step. But if North Korea, again, depending on the provocation, I think we're pretty much aligned, even with China. And of course, Japan has been the most strong ally in terms of the U.S.'s policy towards North Korea.
So taking a little longer term view out, maybe even beyond 2018, you see more convergence in terms of unity on the North Korea issue? Or how do you play the suggestion that Washington and Tokyo seem to have emerged with a very strong shoulder-to-shoulder position that is more about maximum pressure, and that South Korea may lean eventually over time toward Russia and China and the orientation perhaps toward more negotiation, perhaps to a less strong policy, as some people might term it?
Convergence and divergence will depend on U.S.'s policy option, what U.S. will decide ultimately to do. I think if we just move forward with sanctions and pressure, I think most countries are with that, particularly if North Korea continues with the testing and provocations. But I don't think Seoul and Washington are at all going to be in the same place when it comes to military option. You heard Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa said today that it's absolutely not thinkable, and Washington cannot go forth with military option without Seoul's consent. So if Washington tries to go with that option of kinetic option, I don't think anybody is really going to be with Washington unless North Korea's provocation is so great. They are giving us almost that justification. Even with a nuclear atmospheric test, which I do think that's China's own red line, I don't know if anybody's for military option. So that's where you will see divergence. So it really depends on what Washington ultimately decides to do in terms of what we are going to do with North Korea.
In the event of that, what would that do to the U.S.-South Korea relationship? Would it challenge it, destroy it, somewhere in between?
It depends on why we took that why we used force. So was there atmospheric nuclear test? Was there something that was very significant that North Korea did? I think in this situation where North Korea is not doing much more, we just took a preventive military strike, I think that would seriously harm U.S.-South Korea relations. I think even Japan would, and just think about potential retaliation coming from North. The danger here is that there are some folks who actually think, when they're thinking about limited military strike, that Kim Jong-un might not retaliate or just retaliate in a very limited way, and that's going to take us back to the negotiating table. There are people who actually make this argument, using Kim Jong-un's rationality is a reason. They even say, Sue, you said Kim Jong-un is rational. You said he's not suicidal. Therefore, if we do take military action in some limited way, he's not going to escalate into all-out conflict or war that's going to lead to the end of the regime, all-out war. The problem is, we do not know that. That's an assumption. I don't think anybody really knows what Kim Jong-un will or not do. From my perspective, I think they will have to retaliate. There's whole domestic reasons for doing so. But again, so if there is a retaliation and there's significant casualties in South Korea and Japan, and United States acted unilaterally, I think that would create a serious problem in terms of alliance with South Korea and Japan.
Mm-hmm. So ultimately then, doesn't that make for the argument that North Korea would not test? Because in the event that it does, it gives the United States then the excuse to go forward. Wouldn't a quieter North Korea be the more pragmatic option by way of North Korean strategy?
Would what?
Wouldn't a North Korea that chooses not to test then make sense? Wouldn't the better avenue for North Korean strategists be to not pursue that because they provide the United States the excuse to go forward?
But they could call us bluff, right? So Washington is trying to give North Korea this very binary choice of two options. Give up nukes while we're doing sanctions, pressure, and we might even strike you. What North Koreans are also doing is also trying to force us to make this between these two very, very extreme choices, which is we're not going to give up nukes, and if you want us to stop, you might have to use a military strike. So what if Kim Jong-un calls us bluff? Because North Korea does want to complete the program. Kim Jong-un tested 4 nuclear weapons in 6 years, and 90 tests. He's been speeding towards just completing the program. 90 tests, that's double the number that his father and grandfather have tested combined. So to give up here, when the rest of the world is saying, you're not there yet, you don't have the capability to attack mainland United States. So he's about 95% there, but to give up here, I also don't say. So it could very well be that Kim Jong-un call us bluff and say, because of all the potential catastrophic consequences, end of the alliance with South Korea, Japan, nobody is going to be for kinetic option. We're going to go there, and I'm going to call you, Mr. Trump, bluff in terms of attacking us. Yeah. Because we have up to 60 nuclear warheads, because we have 14,000 conventional artillery pieces within 60 seconds of Seoul.
Yeah. So my last point before I move to the studio audience and their questions is, how do you put that also against the idea that Kim Jong-un now needs to turn to the second part of Byungchun, which is economic development? That perhaps the pronouncement in December that they were at this level of ultimate success, despite the disintegration in Japanese waters in terms of the November 29th test, means that he now needs to change to creating a more effective economy. And that means trying to push for sanctions reduction. And that means trying to, which seem to be having an impact. Sanctions, by all accounts that we're hearing, seem to be having now an impact, however nationed. Will he turn, do you think, towards that economic reform aspect? And does that mitigate in any way the chance of conflict?
But how can he do that while these severe sanctions are continually in place, and I don't see them being lifted anytime soon? And I don't think Moon administration is also going to give them a sanctions relief. And we are going to absolutely go full with sanctions. So how is he going to be able to turn to economic development?
You freeze, you enter a moratorium, and then you argue off sanctions over time.
That they're going to stop testing. The problem is, I don't think because Washington has such mistrust of the Kim regime, we see it as them buying time. The problem with freeze is that we cannot verify. Just because they've frozen the testing, it doesn't mean they're not continuing with the program, right? They can try to continue with the program, and we're not verifying that. So I don't see Washington giving them any kind of sanctions relief. That's the problem. This administration is going to continue with pressure, even more pressure coming in the coming year, continually squeezing the Kim Jong-un regime financially and diplomatically. This is why I think the North has to come back, get back to the provocation cycle. Maybe you're right. Maybe they will just stop here. But the sanctions will still continue.
I just wonder, because the pattern of North Korean behavior is to walk it to the line and then step back.
But
I'm wondering if
Kim Jong-il
if we are getting to the point of that not being the case.
We'll see this year. I don't think Kim Jong-un we know enough about this cycle, that walking back. It was his father who did pay lip service to denuclearization, who did go through this whole cycle and came back and tried to at least deal with Washington. We'll see with Kim Jong-un. I don't think anybody really know exactly what he's going to do. But I will tell you where the administration's head is at right now is there's not going to be sanctions relief. We're going to continue. Even if they stop testing, the idea is to continue because they're not until they come back to the table to talk about denuclearization. So just because they stop testing, it's not going to make us stop with sanctions. So as long as they don't get that sanctions relief, this is what I'm saying, we're back to that vicious cycle of North Korea coming back to provocation. So I want to deliver better news, and I don't want to be such a pessimist. And hopefully things work out better this year. But we're sort of trying to forecast, and this is my candid assessment.
Yeah, and I think we both agree the tensions are at the highest level that they have been in our lifetime.
Well, right now, at least there's some thaw with the Olympics and the cheerleaders and the Morambong and the North Korean version of pop star coming to South Korea and all that. So hopefully this will continue. That the Moon administration will gain some momentum out of this, and work out a miracle. I'm just not overly optimistic.
Dr. Sumi Terry, thank you. Before we wrap at the hour, I did want to go ahead and mention a few upcoming things that we'd love to have you back for. One is Thursday night. Scott Snyder from the Council on Foreign Relations will be here to discuss his new book, South Korea at the Crossroads, which really looks at the balance for South Korea and the strategy from Seoul relative to the United States, relative to Beijing and other realities. It's a fantastic new read. And we strongly encourage you to purchase a copy. You can get that through Columbia University Press, of course, Amazon and other sources. But Scott will be here, and he will be very happy to sign books to those of you in attendance. So that's this coming Thursday at 6 p.m. The Saturday, just after, we have Family Day, and we would invite you to please bring any young ones whom you'd like. I had also mentioned that we have an event here on democracy and marking 30 years from the 1987 transition, and that will take place February 15th and 16th. In the interim, we do have Olympic programs, and we had Lee Hee-bom, the president of the Pyeongchang Organizing Committee, here with the Sports Minister Do in November, and we will be continuing on with the February 7th discussion here in the morning, just 2 days before the opening of the Games, on where things stand relative to some of the questions we've talked about today, but the unveiling of Pyeongchang. And then on February 9th, we'll be showing the opening ceremonies. We will have up daily during the Olympic Games on our newly installed projector a very nice telecast. That is completely gratis. Please feel free to come to the Korea Society during the daytime if you would like to see that. Lastly, if you would take the time to enjoy the Hamsup exhibition here and in our gallery at the conclusion, you're most welcome. And if you would consider signing up to be members of the Korea Society, if you haven't already, please see us at koreasociety.org. So let me thank Jonathan Corrado in the back, who is our Associate Director for Policy, for all of his kind efforts, as well as Peter Stemke, who does all of our great audio and video. And I see a host of our other staff in the back as well. Please do meet them and say hello. They work very hard for Korea-U.S. friendship. And finally, thank you, Sumi Terry, for returning here to the Korea Society, for your grace and your thoughtfulness, always your eloquence. We wish you well, especially with the new CSIS assignment, and we hope you consider this a stage for your activities for CSIS up here whenever you want to talk those issues. And we know that people like yourself, Victor Cha, Mike Green, have been very dear to the Korea Society, and we certainly are here for you in that process. So thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Sumi Terry.